We're going to end this week with a module on yield curves, and the yield curves give the relationship between different maturities, typically of Treasury bills, and their yields. And their yields are measured by yield to maturity. Here are three different shaped yield curves. A is a positive yield curve, B is an inverted yield curve, and C is a flat yield curve. A is a positive yield curve, and in that case, as we increase yield to or maturity, our yield to maturity increases, and this would be indicative of, in general, increasing interest rates over the time period. And if we see a positive yield curve, what that would generally imply is that our spot rates are going up over time, as well as our forward rates are going up over time. B is an inverted yield curve. We see this very seldom, but an inverted yield curve would mean that interest rates are that the yield to maturity is decreasing with higher maturities. This would be an indication that in the future, interest rates are expected to decline. C is a flat yield curve, and flat yield curve we would have yield to maturities not varying much by maturity, and that would be indicative of a flat interest rates and expectations into the future. If we have a flat yield curve, spot rates would be flat and actually equal the yield to maturities, as well as the forward rates would be flat. We are currently in a positive or increasing yield maturity environment, and this is shown on this slide, which shows yields for treasuries on October 5th, 2012. Here you can see the yields on 1 month bill, 3 month bill, all the way up to 30-year bonds and their yields. You can see that those yields increase. At a 1 month bill, we have 0.109% yield, and that is 0.109% yield. That again increases, and the highest yield is for the 30-year bond, or 2.976%. Again, this would be an increasing yield curve, which would indicate that interest rates or yields in the future are expected to increase. So we're looking at an environment where we're expecting yields to increase. That is pretty common, and as we'll discuss on the next slide, there's a number of reasons to expect that. One of the notes about this yield curve, or what you're looking at currently, is that it is low, at least by historical standards. We would often have in the past seen those 1 month and 6 month bills to be in closer to 3% range, and even higher than that during certain time periods. So we're looking at a very low yield environment right now. Another thing about the yield curve right now is that the Fed is trying to flatten that yield curve, or get the 30-year bond rates and the other note rates, or the longer term maturity rates, down, while increasing the nearby yield to maturities. Again, this is what we're currently looking at, and this data was taken from yesterday. There are various theories that attempt to explain why or the shape of the term structure of interest rate. Here you see those listed, and you can read those in the book. What they're in general trying to do is explain why in general we see a positive yield curve, why we would expect, or we usually see an expectation of increasing yields in the future, increasing interest rates in the future, when in fact we know that interest rates aren't always increasing. That we generally operate in a pretty flat environment. So why do those yield curves usually exhibit a positive increase in the future? And various theories have been put forward to explain that phenomenon. The section on page 410 discusses some of the major influences on the shape of the yield curve that have been identified in empirical studies, and there have been three major influences. The first is the market expectation of future rate changes, and if the market's expecting interest rates to increase or decrease, that will influence the yield curve. Bond risk premium is the second factor, and as we move out over time, there's greater uncertainty about about yields in general, and that may lead to more premium, although in theory you can't say that for certain. And the third factor that's been identified is convexity bias, and that is as you increase the yield to maturity and increase the maturity, bond rates are much more sensitive to price changes. All of those may explain why we have the yield curve that we do, but it is somewhat complex and controversial why we have the shapes that we do and why we observe the positive yield curve as the most predominant yield curve over time.